After the mixed reception of Sonic Lost World, and after the disastrous handling and release of the Sonic Boom franchise, fans were begging Sonic Team to take their time with the next release. The fandom was in a state of worry, and at its lowest point since the release of Sonic 06. The next game would be very important, because if it bombed like the Sonic Boom series, Sonic would once again become a laughingstock. It would be genuinely embarrassing how the development team could go from Sonic Generations 3 years prior to once again releasing games on the same level of quality as Shadow the Hedgehog or Sonic 06. It seems like Sega were also stumped on what to do and needed to re-energize the franchise any way they could. Enter Christian Whitehead, a prominent member of the Sonic fangame community who Sega had previously contacted to create remastered ports of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2, and Sonic CD for smartphones alongside developer Headcanon, founded in 2012. During the creation of these ports, Whitehead used his already developed engine that he implemented on previous fangames, titled the Retro Engine, which gained attention for its accuracy to the original titles. With the ports under his belt and the faithfully recreated engine, Sega must have wanted to inject fresh blood into the series, because they entrusted Whitehead with creating the next installment in the 2D classic Sonic series. With development starting in 2015, the game was to be a celebration for Sonic's 25th anniversary. Codenamed Sonic Discovery, Whitehead worked on a prototype for a couple of months before showing Takashi Iizuka, who suggested some ideas in regards to the levels and gave it the working title Sonic Mania, which ultimately stuck for the final release. Whitehead was the director and lead producer for Sonic Mania. Working alongside Headcanon and Pagoda West Games, development seemingly went smoothly, with Takashi Iizuka and Sonic Team supervising the project just to make sure that they don't go too crazy with their ideas. Gone is everybody who has worked on a Sonic project this decade. They were focused on developing the 3D tie-in for Sonic's anniversary, Sonic Forces. But we're not at that game yet, thankfully, so let's bask in the moment of talking about Sonic Mania. It's genuinely inspiring seeing somebody go from making fan games to releasing a fully fledged official release of a series they obviously hold dear. To shoulder that much responsibility must have been a big challenge for Whitehead, but he successfully knocks it out of the park. It's a little bit embarrassing for Sonic Team that a fan knows the intricacies of their series more than they do, but for Whitehead, it must have felt like a dream come true. I think this external approach to Sonic Mania's development is a good one. It's clear that throughout this decade, the internal work within Sonic Team has been confused, messy, disappointing, and, more importantly, mediocre. While there has been some diamonds in the rough, it's obvious everyone was at a loss on how to progress the series and how to make it stable again. Through the inconsistent directors, the shoddy attempt at creating their own Sonic 4, the very different 3D games, Sonic Boom, everything about the series felt like it was on the edge of tipping over into calamity again. I think having the next 2D Sonic game being externally developed by Western developers who Sonic Team obviously trusts, while having Iizuka oversee the project was a good idea. Sonic is primarily made with a Western audience in mind anyway, and the series always performs better in the West, so I think this approach is a no-brainer. Sonic Mania was made by a fan, for the fans, by someone who is so prominent in the community. Whitehead would obviously know what the fans would expect, what level design and music tickles their fancy, and how to implement nostalgia without going overboard, while presenting his own unique ideas for zones and stage mechanics. I remember how chaotic the internet became after the initial reveal. The game looked like everything everyone ever wanted from Sonic Team. The updated but classic art style grabbed everybody's attention, and Sonic, Tails and Knuckles being playable again helped too. It was reeking with personality that the series had been lacking for so long. Other trailers such as the pre-order trailer and the launch trailer were animated and intertwined together. It was important that Sonic Mania was being advertised as a fun return to form through its advertising, and when it released, it went on to become the most critically acclaimed Sonic games in 15 years. Be proud of yourself, Christian Whitehead. It's a good game. Anyway, I've seemingly built the game up on its tremendous amount of praise, but it's a nice change of pace to talk about a 2D Sonic game that released this decade that is actually good. Upon starting up the game, you're greeted with a bombastic animated sequence of Sonic, Tails and Knuckles exploring, running around, and generally just having a good time. The main enemies of this game are hinted at, some stages are shown at a glimpse, and the trio unite and charge towards Eggman. I love the art style here. The charming vibe it builds up is unrivaled. There's a reason that after Sonic Mania's release, the animated series Sonic Mania Adventures was made, and it's because this style is perfect for the quirky, lovable characters in the Sonic universe. This animation is quite important, because straight away it alerts the player to how much love and care has been poured into Mania. You can't have an animation this good and this confident if the game isn't also stellar, and luckily for us, it is. Before I talk about the actual game though, I have a menu to talk about, guys, come on. Upon starting the game, you're given little option on what to choose. There's Mania mode, which is just the main game, and then 2 hidden modes behind question marks. You unlock these after completing the first zone, so I don't feel bad about spoiling what they are. They're simply the time attack and competition mode in this game. Time attack is just exactly what it sounds like, a race against the clock. Get to the end of the stage as fast as you can using any character to set records and work towards beating them. Competition mode though is a 2-player version of time attack where you race against the other player to see who is the fastest. If we carry on down the menu, there's extras to be unlocked and DLC to purchase. The DLC is quite cool actually, because it adds forgotten characters Mighty the Armadillo and Ray the Flying Squirrel as playable characters, as well as a new Encore mode, which sees the player go through altered level design and different gameplay mechanics to the Mania mode, but I'll go more in depth about that later. So, the main game, the thing everybody was waiting for. Does it live up to expectations? Well, let's talk about it. Upon booting up the main game, Sonic and Tails are flying into action to get to Angel Island, a neat reference to Sonic 3 and Knuckles. They detected a powerful energy reading, but unfortunately for them, Dr. Eggman had already sent a group of egg robos to excavate the source of the signal. It turns out that it was a magical gemstone known as a Phantom Ruby, which is quite an important MacGuffin for this game and the following game, Sonic Forces. More on that when the time comes. Anyway, with the power of the Phantom Ruby, the Egg Robos transform into the hard-boiled heavies and send Sonic, Tails, and the nearby Knuckles through time and space to venture through zones of old and new using the Ruby's power. Sonic and Pals pursue Eggman and the heavies through a plethora of stages to prevent them from using the Ruby's power for evil. I can imagine after being presented something fresh and intriguing, a few people may have been disappointed at the return of Green Hill Zone. It is a shock, you see. Sonic Mania is mostly old rather than new. There's only 4 new stages in the game: Studiopolis, Press Garden, Mirage Saloon, and Titanic Monarch. And while they are great stages, all of the old ones can feel like you're retreading ground that Sonic Generations, or even Sonic 4 Duology attempted to remake too. I have to say quickly that I do prefer Sonic Mania's recreation of these old levels over Generations and the Sonic 4 games, but it's a bit of a letdown with how Generations essentially done the whole remake old stages for an anniversary title 5 years prior, and now this game is doing it too. It must be said though, these old stages feel as fresh as they could be, because they've been remixed and tweaked enough to feel different and not stale. They are still as exciting to play through, even if their level themes aren't original. For example, Green Hill Zone Act 1 is quite similar to the first act of the original Green Hill Zone in the original Sonic game, until near what would normally be the end of the stage. Here, the zone then presents a couple of areas taken from Act 2 in the original Sonic game. New pathways are introduced, underground and in the sky, and the boss of the act is fought inside of a cave. Act 2 then uses gimmicks that were introduced in Act 1, as well as zip lines to get around. Act 2 is divided into several paths like Act 1, but it feels fresher and more original. Every returning zone is like this. Act 1 remixes a few things but is grounded in familiarity, and then Act 2 introduces new gameplay elements and ramps things up a notch. It's a welcome approach. Comparing it to Sonic 4 for a second, a series that also included a lot of gimmicks, especially Episode 1, I do not have a problem with any of the gimmicks found in Sonic Mania, unlike Sonic 4. In Sonic 4, the gimmicks felt shoehorned in, they didn't fit the flow of the game, and they were annoying and removed me from the experience. In Sonic Mania, the gimmicks are quick, they're fast, they feel natural, and are fun to use. It also helps that this game feels like a classic title, unlike Sonic 4, which feels alien in comparison. The physics in Sonic Mania are closer to the classic titles than any other attempt from the past decade, whether it's Sonic 4 or Generations. I don't play the classic titles a whole bunch, so from a casual side of things, they feel the exact same. They're perfect. The momentum feels amazing, the weight of the characters feels the exact same, and the amount of speed you can build up to burst through the stages is unrivaled. Mix this in with some stellar level design, and Mania feels like the Sega Saturn Sonic game that was never made. Adding on to the physics is the new drop dash ability, which is essentially a spin dash in midair, which when you land on the ground, you'll be propelled forward like a normal spin dash. It's quite good for keeping up your speed, or to quickly accelerate after being hit by an enemy. Other than that, everything controls exactly like it did in the classic titles. Sonic still runs fast, Tails can still fly, Knuckles can still climb walls to reach hidden areas. Everything here is true to how it originally was all of them years ago. There's just an additional movement option in the drop dash that adds to the formula and makes it more interesting. Going back to the stages though, the selection here is enjoyable. It's a good blend of iconic stages from the series past, such as Green Hill and Chemical Plant, and then stages people might have never played or forgotten about, such as Stardust Speedway and Lava Reef. The remix stages are fun to play, and they feel different enough from their original counterparts that it doesn't feel annoying having to experience something similar to what you may have already played. There is a good variety of platforming challenges here for you to overcome that make each zone feel different besides the obvious aesthetic changes. For example, Press Garden sees you having to freeze yourself into a block of ice to slide into other blocks of ice to destroy them and progress with the level. Or Studiopolis, in which you have to hop onto a broadcasting van and be zapped towards a new destination. Sonic is literally riding the airwaves. Or finally, in Flying Battery Zone, when you need to spin sideways on poles to avoid spikes and enemies, as well as making it to the other side of the ship to carry on with the level. Each zone, despite the visual changes, also plays completely different from one another. It's hard to pick a favourite when they all stand out and overwhelm you with everything that is going on. These zones are brought to life with the beauty that is Sonic Mania. The game's animated intro foreshadows how bright, colourful and beautiful this game is to look at. Every stage is popping with colour. It's so vibrant that sometimes I feel like standing still in the stage to take it all in. If we took screenshots from every single stage and laid them all out in one giant picture, it would be mesmerising to absorb all the colour that has been implemented to bring these stages to life. The variation in the colour palette is a sight to behold. It will leave you stunned playing some of these stages. My personal favourites in terms of how beautiful they are Press Garden, Studiopolis, Stardust Speedway and Mirage Saloon. Press Garden Act 1 takes place in a newspaper printing factory, filled with things that you'd expect from a factory environment, but by looking out the windows, the thought of Act 2 looms over you. It's here that the zone really shines, taking place in a surreal winter landscape within a Japanese garden outside of a castle. The area is filled with sakura trees and ancient architecture. This is my favourite zone in the game now that I think about it. I love how comforting everything feels about it, but mainly the beauty of the pink petals falling down the sky. Studiopolis takes place in a gigantic cinema metropolis. There's a lot of darker colours used here, but it allows the bright colours to stand out and blow you away. Being a film guy myself, this stage is a joy to play through, and I appreciate the lengths gone to make the theme feel authentic. One thing I like about Stardust Speedway is that it takes place on the mysterious Little Planet. Act 1 of this stage takes place in the past and features a lot of earthy tones such as browns, greens and yellows. The second act then takes place in the future, and it's a lot brighter here with an alluring purple background and strobe lights making it feel like a city that is being lived in. The final stage that tickles my fancy, Mirage Saloon, takes place in the Wild West. The neat thing about this stage is that if you're playing as Knuckles, you experience a unique Act 1 that no other character can traverse. What awaits you is gorgeous shades of purple, pink and orange. It's so pretty to look at. Whereas if you're playing as any other character, the stage takes place on the Tornado and features sandy bright yellow colours, greens, purples and browns. It is crazy how an act taking place in the same zone can look so different, but it works so well that the two don't feel separate from each other. You can genuinely believe they both coexist. Similarly to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, at the end of every act is a boss fight. The first act is usually quickly disposed of and is nothing special. They're fun, but they're nothing you haven't seen before. The boss fights in the second act is where things truly get fun. Ever wanted to fight the Death Egg robot on Green Hill? Well, thanks to Sonic Mania, you can! I like the callbacks they did for the boss fights. The Dr. Robotnik Mean Bean Machine reference and chemical plant must have been a big shock to anyone who played it on release day. The Metal Sonic boss fight in Stardust Speedway Act 2 is also insane to me. The first time playing this boss stumped me and cost me a lot of lives. It's so cool seeing Metal Sonic transform into a giant monster. This thing hasn't been done since Sonic Heroes back in 2003. This thing is truly menacing, but I got lucky on this playthrough and my buddy Tails cheesed him for me. You can also fight the hard-boiled heavies too, and they all have different personalities that lead to interesting fights. For example, the heavy shinobi is fought in Press Garden. He jumps around a lot and throws shuriken like projectiles. You need to be patient and wait for your time to strike, like a true ninja. You then fight the heavy magician in Mirage Saloon, who transforms into some familiar faces. Fang the sniper, Bean the Dynamite Duck, and Bark the Polar Bear. The fight is fun, but further highlights how these guys seriously need to be in a Sonic game in a full-time role. Moving on to the final boss though, taking a big jump to the final boss, it's quite challenging. It starts off with Eggman in this octopus-like robot charged with the power of the Phantom Ruby. Its tentacles are electric and can be tricky to avoid. After enough time has passed, he then summons Ruby unavoidable hands that grab and teleport you to a mini sub-boss featuring the hard-boiled heavies. These moments are brief, but they can be tricky trying to keep a hold of the minimal rings that you're given. After being bopped enough times, the Phantom Egg, as it's known, blows up, and it's here that if you collected all the 7 Chaos Emeralds, the true final boss begins. The leader of the hard-boiled heavies has transformed into the Phantom King and swipes the Phantom Ruby from Sonic. Eggman arrives in his Kleptomobile in an attempt to recapture the Ruby, and the whole fight is essentially hot potato over who has the Ruby, Eggman or the Phantom King. As Super Sonic, you need to bash into both of these guys in order to reclaim the Ruby and put an end to this mess. It can be quite tricky at first, having to keep an eye on your ring count while avoiding projectiles, knowing when to use a dash attack, while flying in 8 directions. It can be a bit overwhelming, but it's not that hard once you've figured it out. It still makes for a fun, iconic boss fight, and is a lot more memorable than previous boss fights from this decade. Seriously, I can't even remember the final boss in Sonic 4 Episode 1, and I can only remember the one from Episode 2's because it's shaped like a heart. Sonic Colors and Lost Worlds share the same final boss, and Generations' final boss is rather lackluster. I'd honestly say that this final boss in Sonic Mania is probably one of the best final bosses in the series, but definitely one of the best from the games that were released in the 2010s anyway. To even fight the true final boss, you need to unlock Super Sonic, which is where the special stages come into play. Hopping into a giant ring hidden throughout the stages, reminiscent of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you'll be transported to a special stage and be given an attempt to collect a Chaos Emerald. Taking a note out of Sonic CD's book, the special stages see the camera being stationed behind Sonic as he runs through a 3D stage. Differing from CD, however, is the fact that you need to collect blue spheres to increase your speed to chase after a robot keeping the emerald captive. You start off with about 40 rings, which is the equivalent to 40 seconds of real life time. Gathering more rings increases the time, but there's only a certain amount of them, so you have to be speedy. Some stages include power-ups such as a bundle of rings or increasing the blue sphere meter to increase your speed. These stages are fun and beat out the special stages found in Sonic 4 Episode 1 and 2. They require some level of strategy too. Are you going to prioritize rings or blue spheres? What is the best way to cut corners and reach the robot the quickest? Should you attempt a shortcut and risk falling off the stage, or should you play it safe? These special stages are fun, challenging, and might actually be my favourite in the series. They're also beaming with colour and all look different from each other. It's a joy to discover what they all look like. They aren't the only special stages in the game though. If you collect 25 rings and run into a checkpoint, a star or circle will form above the post, which then takes you to a bonus stage. The bonus stages here are the exact same special stages in Sonic 3 and Knuckles and play identically to them. Here, you need to find all the blue spheres and transform them into rings. You do this by running along the outside of bundles of them when they're arranged into squares and collect the rings that they transform into. However, be careful, because once running into a blue sphere, they transform into red spheres that kick you out of the stage upon touching them. Not every blue sphere can be turned into a ring though, as some appear in jittery lines surrounded by bumpers to knock you back into the newly created red sphere. Your reward for completing this stage is a medallion, which unlocks bonus features in Mania mode and extras, things such as the Super Peel Out from Sonic CD or the debug mode. These are neat additions to go after if you're not ready to put the game down and want to get more bang for your buck. Finally, I need to talk about the music. It is incredible. T. Lopes just understands what it means to create retro-inspired music while keeping it fresh and funky. I'm sorry, John Sonoe, I'll always love you for what you've done for the 3D games, but I wouldn't mind if someone else created the soundtracks for the 2D games from now on. The Mania soundtrack is gorgeous, it's an explosion of love, and it fits perfectly for the game. It feels like it belongs on the Genesis, and that T. Lopes is taking us on a one-way trip back to the past, and he's having a blast while he's taking us there. It's hard to pick a favourite because they're all amazing, but both tracks from Metallic Madness, Mirage Saloon, Press Garden, and of course Studiopolis are a joy to listen to. They're so good, I will never tire of these tracks, and it brings the already extravagant stages more life and personality. Egg Reverie also slaps too, and is a great final boss song. It makes flying around a Supersonic more fun. The soundtrack is the final cherry on top of an already great game, and it ties everything together nicely to take the experience to another level. Sonic Mania is a love letter to the classic style of games, taking so many elements from Sonic's previous 2D adventures and giving them a twist. So much care, time, and effort has been poured into making this game, and it makes the game feel like a true sequel to the classic titles. There's still so much I haven't touched upon, like the elemental shields returning and being exactly the same as they were in Sonic 3 Knuckles, the neat Easter eggs such as Sega Club references, Daytona references, and the reference to Genesis does what Nintendo don't slogan from the 90s. It feels like a celebration of all things Sonic, and proves that when put into the right hands, the 2D games can still be fun to play, even for modern audiences. It's a shame that Sonic 4 Episode 1 and 2 were given the mantle of Sonic 4, they don't deserve to be considered sequels to the classic titles. Sonic Mania is the true sequel to the games from the 90s, and deserves all the praise that it gets. It's so good that they had to go and make the Encore DLC, which you should definitely get if you enjoy Sonic Mania as much as I do. How does the game end though? Well, after defeating Eggman and the Phantom King, Sonic becomes separated from the Chaos Emeralds due to the power of the Phantom Ruby. The Emeralds and the Ruby interact with each other briefly, creating a wormhole to another dimension that Sonic gets sucked into. Knuckles and Tails are stood outside of Titanic Monarch and Little Planet, watching it disappear with a blast of light as Sonic travels to another dimension. There's various endings depending on who you're playing as, they're all essentially the same with minor differences, but this one is considered the canon ending, because it leads us directly into the next game.